Welcome to EDW 2021. I'm really excited to kick off this conference. This is our first time doing it, and this year we have 2 days of talks plus Q&A. So ask your questions in chat while the talk is happening, and then a moderator will queue them up and interview the presenter after each talk. Before I get too far into the state of the platform, I want to talk a little bit about EDW itself. We've wanted to do EDW for years. There are a lot of great conferences in this space, but nothing quite like this. There are a lot of great technical conferences, but they're mainly focused on bringing together people already working in open source software. These are great opportunities for collaboration between projects, but you see a lot of the same faces there. And there are some events that are focused on outreach, but they're usually marketed towards consumers or the enterprise. And they're often more of expo-style events or feature a lot of demo talks. EDW is both a technical conference and an outreach event, but we're primarily focused on app developers. And we want to take a strong education focus so that you come away from EDW with new skills, not just more information. And we want to try to reach people outside of the existing free and open source software circles. As we grow, we want to take a holistic view with the type of talks we feature and include development adjacent subjects. Code is just one part of what we do as app developers. So we want to feature talks about design, accessibility, entrepreneurship, and even things like audience engagement. And of course, EDW is focused on the Elementary OS platform. Elementary is in a unique position in the Linux-based operating system space. We provide a desktop environment, we make a suite of first-party apps, we build an operating system to ship those things, and we build an app store so that you can ship your apps. With other distros, you may only get one or two of those things, and the rest are add-ons developed by a bunch of different organizations. So we're always thinking about the complete developer story, from the first read of the docs all the way through publishing. And ethical monetization to make sure that app development is sustainable. And I think that focus has paid off. We have nearly 200 apps written specifically for AppCenter and Elementary OS. These are all new apps, not ports, and they're all open source. So far, we've paid out about $14,000 to app developers. And we use the same pay-what-you-can model as Elementary OS. The average purchase price for an AppCenter app is about $2.50 right now. It's pretty clear that we need to expand, but this is a really great start. Last year, we campaigned on this idea of AppCenter for everyone, where we tried to reimagine a more cross-platform AppCenter. It's still Elementary OS first, has the same high quality and the same native integration. But we also want to make AppCenter apps available for other Linux-based operating systems, like Ubuntu or Fedora. So developers can write once for Elementary OS and reach millions of Linux users. Now, some say that the higher barrier to entry for native apps is unattractive, or native app development is dead. But we disagree. We're building a regulated marketplace with the highest quality and only using open standards. Think of it like the California standard in vehicle emissions, but for apps. We want to set a high bar that everyone benefits from. And we're already attracting developers by providing a complete and compelling platform. And in some ways, it's a lot more straightforward than the web-based platforms. So what does that look like in 2021? Well, let's start with Vala. Vala is the programming language that we use at Elementary to write all of our first-party apps. It has a modern syntax and modern language features. It's very productive, so we want to spend a lot less time writing boilerplate code. And we think that the best code is code that's easy for humans to read. Vala transpiles to C, so it's fast and it's native. And it's built specifically for the G stack. In fact, glib is a native namespace in Vala. So you get a huge utility library right out of the box. That includes things like settings, time and date utilities, platform APIs like actions and notifications, IPC over dbus, and even file operations. Plus, Vala is compatible with tons of other libraries, and there are expansive API docs on valadoc.org. We build all of our source code with Meson. The Meson build system's popularity has taken off among open source projects over the past couple years. It uses a simple, non-Turing complete DSL, but if you need a little bit more power on the hood, under the hood, you can extend it with Python. Meson has fast compile times, and it has built-in extensions for the GStack and things like getText localization. So there's no need for additional modules like some other build systems. We package up our applications with Flatpak. Now, in the traditional Linux distribution model, you often have maintainers that package other people's apps for them. That's because traditionally, packaging is difficult, and you have to package applications for each individual distribution separately. Well, with Flatpak, you only need a single manifest file in either JSON or YAML. And you can install Flatpak apps on all major Linux-based operating systems. Elementary provides a Flatpak runtime that includes most of the common build dependencies that you need. So likely, your app's Flatpak file will look very similar to this one. But you can also easily vendor in any other dependencies you need in any version, even if it's not available in the host operating system. Flatpaks are sandboxed by default, and you can poke holes where you need them, but many libraries automatically use portals to escape the sandbox, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So here it is, a packaged native app in about 60 lines, not including metadata. Here it is. This is a whole app. For your metadata, you'll need two files. A launcher file that gets installed alongside your app and describes your app to the applications menu and dock. This is where you would declare your application this is where you would declare your application-wide actions. You also need an XML file for the App Store. This is where you list screenshots, have your marketing copy, or declare what category you want to be in the store. What about system APIs? Well, Elementary is part of Free Desktop, which is the cross-platform standard for desktop Linux. So when you write for our native APIs, your apps are automatically portable to desktops like GNOME and KDE, which run on Ubuntu, Fedora, Manjaro, and more. This includes things like launcher actions, which appear in the context menu in the dock or the applications menu, and they're also available via search in Elementary OS. If you have a music player, it includes media controls, so you can get track and artist info and album art. It also includes notifications, which can show images, badge icons, buttons, have a sense of urgency, or even replace old stale notifications with new updated ones. And on Elementary OS, this includes the Notification Center and Platform Notification settings. Plus, portals, which are the new standard for sandbox apps. In Elementary OS 6, we ship with a native file chooser portal and things like the color picker. And we're planning to expand that more as we go. Now, you need a toolkit to build graphical applications, right? The toolkit that we use is GTK. It has all of the common widgets that you'd expect, like buttons, checkboxes, text entries, and more. And it works hand in hand with glib action. So actionable widgets will automatically trigger global actions associated with them and are affected by global action states. So if you have a disabled action in your application, the widget will reflect that state. It also includes some widgets that are a little bit more difficult to build on the web, like popovers, switches, even progress bars, menus with submenus. And you can quickly create layouts with container widgets like the grid, flowbox, or listbox. Plus, GTK comes with animation primitives, so you can crossfade elements, slide to reveal, create a paging UI, or more, without doing a bunch of custom drawing code. and all GTK widgets are styled with GTK CSS. See, widgets have nodes that follow the CSS box model. So almost anything that you can style in CSS on the web, you could do in GTK too. And of course, it comes with an inspector. So you can prototype your styles or change widget properties on the fly. GTK also has built-in localization features, including right-to-left layout support. So if your application is translated to Arabic or Hebrew, it'll automatically flip and display in the correct way in those languages. If you really love your programming language, you can keep that too, because GTK has bindings for all kinds of popular languages, including C, Python, JavaScript, and even Rust. There are two more toolkit components that we ship in the elementary Flatpak runtime. Granite, which is an elementary specific platform library, and Handy, which was developed by Purism to bring modern mobile toolkit features to GTK. Let's talk about Granite first. The main purpose of Granite is to make it easier to re-implement common design patterns and keep your apps up to date. If we use a design pattern multiple times when writing our apps, we make sure it gets into Granite. Take, for example, this message dialog. It has a pretty complex layout. You can see that you have a large icon and a smaller icon. You have multiple lines of text with different styling. You have a place for command line output, a space for additional custom widgets, and multiple buttons, some of them with style classes. But you'll notice that in this example, there's no layout code. So if the design changes in the platform, your app won't be left behind when it uses Granite widgets. Granite also includes things like toasts, keyboard shortcut labels, and other platform-specific widgets and utilities. To see everything that Granite includes, including code samples, you can check it out on valadoc.org. This cycle, we've included Handy in our platform. Handy includes tons of multi-touch gesture primitives. Let me see if I can get my video to play here. Sorry about that. Handy includes tons of multi-touch gesture primitives, like this deck, which allows you to have back and forward navigation, which we use in system settings. You can see how straightforward it is to add one-to-one multi-touch gestures to your application with Handy in just a few lines. It also includes things like the carousel, which is what we use in the applications menu and the onboarding app, and recently to draw the login and lock screen. This used to be a lot more difficult to do and require lots of custom drawing code, custom input handling, but now it's really straightforward to build these kind of interfaces with Handy. There's also Handy Window, which includes a less prescriptive way to draw client-side decorations. It's easier than ever to have multi-pane layouts, like you see in this Tasks app example. You can see in the sample code here that we have two header bars, which is the widget that contains window controls, and they're packed into either side of a resizable pane. Handy Window also masks all the corners of your windows, even when they contain web content or video. So you don't have to port to GTK4 just yet to get those rounded corners. What about visual design? Well, since everything in GTK is styled with GTK CSS, you get excellent consistent styling out of the box whenever you use native widgets. Elementary provides a complete CSS framework. Well, it's actually built in Sass, but it includes the dark style. And for most apps, you won't need to do any extra design work to support dark mode. There are also tons of built-in style class constants for things like text headers, small or dim labels, accent colors for text and for icons. And there are also semantic style classes for like warning or error states. Many widgets also have flat variants, like for buttons or action bars. So you can be very expressive using only the built-in styles. But you can also load your own custom CSS style sheets. And we have a handful of exported CSS color variables, like background colors, selection colors, and more, so you can stay consistent with the native styling even in your custom styles. Now, what about icons? That's a pretty important part of your user interface, right? Well, Elementary OS ships with over 400 open source SVG icons. This includes action icons, file types, devices, status icons, many more. We ship these in both full color and symbolic versions. And symbolic icons are automatically recolored in GTK to match the text color in light or dark mode. And you can use those style classes for semantic colors on the icons as well. Plus, you can use custom CSS to make sure that these icons match your brand. There's also right-to-left language variants. So when your application is localized, the arrows will still point the right way. And all of these icons are hinted into platform native sizes. So whether you're using a large icon in something like a dialog or a small icon in something like a button, they'll always be pixel perfect. And you can easily bundle your own icons as well, which we have documentation for in our developer guide. What about developer tools? What kind of tools are we using to build these applications? Well, Elementary OS comes with some great dev tools right out of the box. We have files with the smart path bar and the column view. We have a modern terminal with process completion notifications that even show exit status. And we have natural copy-paste shortcuts, so you don't have to remember to hold down the shift key in the terminal. It also comes with multi-line and pseudo-paste protection and other handy features like this. And there are Git integration in both files and in code. And all three of these applications come with browser class tabs and have features like tab duplication and tab close history. And there are lots of highly discoverable keyboard shortcuts in the context menus and tooltips. And not just in these apps, but in all of the apps that ship with Elementary OS, and even the operating system itself. But unlike other platforms, you're not locked into our tools. Many popular cross-platform apps are already available to sideload from FlatHub. You can use whatever you like, even when it comes time to publish. Because publishing, it's just GitHub. There's no new workflow. We have a minimal dashboard to submit your Git URL, but your issues, release tags, project management, and everything else stays on GitHub. Our review workflow is even built around GitHub pull requests. So you can see where your app is in the review queue, who's reviewing it, comments, and more. The Flatpak Builder action that we use to publish your app in AppCenter is also open source. So you can use it in your own CI. And it uses GitHub artifacts whenever a build is run. So there are no complicated instructions or special apps needed to test fix or feature branches with your users. You don't have to worry about user limits or signups like some other platforms. Just download the bundle file and install with sideload. Our payments backend is built on Stripe Connect, which is available in 44 countries, with more being added. And Stripe includes tools to start your own business, in case you still need to incorporate. Unlike other platforms, there are no sign-up fees to publish in AppCenter. So we only make money when you make money. So this is our platform in 2021. You can find all the documentation on developer.elementary.io. One of the major goals that we have with our documentation is to try to give you more wins more quickly. So you could build an MVP on day one using something like those 3 files that I showed you from earlier. And our developer guide doesn't just include code like some other guides. It's more holistic, like our platform. It includes the build system, packaging, and even things like localization. We have full guides and code samples for important system APIs, with tons more available on valadoc.org. And there are links to more external education resources, like the Linux Foundation's free class on software licensing. We tried to design our human interface guidelines around answering your design questions and providing a foundation for design thinking. So it's hopefully a little less dry than some of the other guides you've read. And Elementary OS is completely open source, so you can get involved and help shape the platform. If an API doesn't exist, you can be a part of creating it. It's not a one-way street like some other platforms. So of course, we have some documentation available to help you get started as a contributor. All of our docs, just like our code, are open source. They're simple markdown files available on GitHub. So you can file issue reports or use GitHub discussions. We're always trying to grow our documentation, and we use your feedback to inform where our focus goes next. So back to EDW. This is our way to reach out to you, to start more conversations about native open source app development, to provide the resources for new developers to learn. I want to give a special shout out to our GitHub sponsors and everyone buying EDW merch. Raising funds is a really important part of growing this event. GitHub sponsors and store purchases help us towards that goal. We're really hoping to do an in-person event next year. I also want to give big shout outs to Jupiter Broadcasting for putting together the live stream and helping us moderate. I'm really excited to answer all of your questions about the platform and EDW, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the talks.
Good morning. Welcome to day one of the Elementary Developer Weekend. My name is Chris.
My name is Wes, and now a live Q&A with founder Daniel Foré and co-founder Cassidy Blady.
Hello, gentlemen.
Hey, Dan.
Hey, how's it going?
Good morning. Hey, thanks for your great talk there, and we've got some great questions that I had after your talk, and also from the chat. Anybody else in the chat who has more questions, feel free to drop them in there, and we'll be monitoring it as we go. So, as a platform, some people might wonder, how big is it? How big is Elementary OS?
That's a really good question. So, as you know, Cass, but as our audience may not know, we don't collect any sort of telemetry in Elementary OS, right? So, the real answer to that question is we don't really know how many users we have. What we do know is how many downloads we have, which doesn't really reflect the number of users, but it can kind of give us a rough idea of, how many people are trying out Elementary OS. And the latest stat we have for that is that I believe Elementary OS 5 has been downloaded about 1.6 million times. And that doesn't include a little bit of gap because we switch our analytics over to the open source plausible analytics, which you can see public. I believe the URL for that is plausible is it IO? Do you have that handy, Cass?
Yeah, it's plausible.io/elementary.io.
There you go. Easy enough. And that also doesn't include torrent downloads either. So the number of people downloading Elementary OS could be much, much higher.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and that's just OS 5 as well. So, that doesn't include all the previous versions, and we'll see where we get with Elementary OS 6 when it's released as well. So if developers wanted to get their hands on Elementary OS 6 to start actually building and developing their apps, where do they go to do that?
Yeah, we have builds of Elementary OS beta available publicly for free at builds.elementary.io. And we also have an early access system where we do daily builds, not because betas are just kind of snapshots, but we have daily builds in the early access that you can get by becoming a GitHub sponsor.
Awesome. Now, during the state of the platform, you talked about some of the technical advantages for developers with native development compared to something like web development. What do you see as user advantages of native apps compared to other technologies?
Yeah, there's a couple of really big ones there. And I think one of the biggest ones is performance and resource usage, right? Like immediately you see when you compare to some other non-native web platforms like Electron, that you can have a fairly simple app that actually uses a ton of resources to do kind of basic things. So the native apps are a lot more performant. But they also have much better integration with system APIs, especially like I was talking about before with some of the free desktop APIs, things like notifications, right? Or the dark style now. But there's also some elementary OS specific things that work a little bit better, like the conceal text feature in Screenshot.
Awesome. Yeah, so it's just way more integrated for users, a way better experience there and all around. Awesome. Let's see, checking for some more questions here. So you showed a lot of platform features in the talk, but for developers who are already building for OS 5, Elementary OS 5, what are some of maybe the biggest or your favorite new features in Elementary OS 6 for developers?
That's a great question. Yeah. So for Elementary OS 6, one of the real big things we did, is we rewrote our style sheet completely from scratch. So we have this brand new Sass style sheet. And so the styles, I think, are a lot more clear, a lot more contrasty. We're using a lot more light and shadow. We added a really great dark style, which your apps can take advantage of now. And we have accent color support, which is really cool. So our users can express themselves a little bit more through the accent color that they choose. But you can also use it to express your brand in your app. Another really big thing that we included this cycle was Handy. And that's where I talked about you could use one-to-one multi-touch gestures in your app with things like the deck and the carousel, rounded corners with Handy window, even for video and web content. And there's tons of other new features in Granite too.
Awesome. Yeah, lots of new good stuff.
Yeah.
All right. Let's say a developer has an app that they've developed and written on Elementary OS 6. How, they've gone through the work to port it to Flatpak. How can they submit it today?
So the AppCenter dashboard that I talked about is something that's kind of still in development and should be public really soon. So just hang on real tight for that. But we are going to be reaching out to some developers who have submitted to AppCenter in the past to do a little bit more of a manual publishing process with them and help make sure that everything ports over correctly.
Awesome. So we should start to see more apps in that AppCenter Flatpak repository soon.
Yep.
Great. During the talk, you mentioned something about over 400 icons being provided by the platform itself. Can you expand on that a little bit? There's icons, but then there's the hinting sizes.
Yeah. So the way icons mainly work in our platform is they're namespaced, and they try to use like semantic names. So you could have an icon name like dialogue-information, right? And this name actually represents a lot of different icons. So it'll represent the icons that are hinted in each size from 16 pixels all the way up to 64 pixels, or in some cases 128 pixels. And then if you append the namespace -symbolic, then you get symbolic versions of those icons, and those can be hinted in multiple sizes as well. And then the toolkit will automatically append -RTL for right to left localization. So one icon name can actually represent like tons of different icons. So we have about 400 icon names, but it represents thousands and thousands of actual icons.
Awesome. Yeah. There's so much work. I mean, Elementary OS started in the early days as an icon set. So there's obviously lots of legacy there and lots of great resources for developers in icons. Let's see, checking the chat for more questions here. We had a couple of questions about non-native toolkits. Can you publish an app center with toolkits other than GTK?
No, we've decided to stick with just GTK because we really want to focus on that tight native integration, that consistent visual style, and make sure that the platform features are working really well. And it's not just things like how something looks or even how it feels in some cases, which can be imitated a little bit, but things like localization support, right? The right to left language handling or accessibility features. A lot of times, non-native apps won't work with accessibility tools like screen readers. And that's really important for us, is to make sure that we can make that promise that when you download an app from AppCenter, that all the system features are going to work with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm not sure how to pronounce names here, so I'm sorry in the chat if I butcher your name if you asked a question. Looks like Stainslaw says, will there be any statistics in the developer dashboard, like how many people are using my apps, etc.?
I think that's something that's a little bit difficult because we want to avoid any kind of user tracking or telemetry, right? So having like an active user count would require your app to kind of send information continuously back. And we really want to avoid that kind of like privacy invading kind of technology. But one thing that we would like to do is provide some more anonymous statistics like download numbers.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that stuff is built into Flatpak and how the Flatpak backend works. So that anonymous usage would be great to have. I'm not sure if there's an issue filed on the project or not, but if you want to check github.com/elementary/appcenter-dashboard, the development's all happening in the open there, and you can file issues for things like download stats. Childish Giant says, are there any plans to add more easily accessible developer support for those getting into making native apps? I've had some stumbling blocks where I cannot find solutions or support.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that a real big advantage for us of having all our documentation open source is that we can make use of GitHub's native platform features, and discussions are a really cool way to make sure that you can be involved in the kind of community that's creating the educational materials there. So I would recommend you go to our docs page on GitHub. So github.com/elementary/docs, and then go to discussions, and you can start a discussion there about something that you're having trouble with, and then we can figure out how to solve that problem with you, and then we could take that and turn it into some great documentation for other people too.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, it's such an advantage of doing everything open and collaboratively, is it can improve for everybody. Zisan Ahmad says, should I learn Vala to contribute to Elementary OS's source code?
Yes, and that's actually one of the really awesome things about elementary in general, is that we have standardized on a single programming language. So in some other cases, it can be difficult to contribute to open source platforms where you have to learn a myriad of languages, right? But with elementary and elementary OS, if you learn Vala, then you can contribute to any software that we develop.
And there's actually a great talk tomorrow morning as well, first thing, how to contribute to Elementary OS, that covers the point of view from a new contributor and how to get involved. So I would highly recommend you check that talk out as well. Let's see, more questions here. Colin asks, where can we send feedback about things like the applications menu?
Yeah, since everything is open source and we're all focused on GitHub, you can go and file a new issue on GitHub issues. So for the applications menu specifically, that's github.com/elementary/applications-menu. And we have great issue templates there that make it really easy for you to file really great issues and explain, the kind of problem you're having and the kind of solution that you're looking for. And then we'll work with you there to figure that out. So we're always open to feedback on any components, and it's all open.
Awesome, yeah. And another thing is the feedback app itself. If you're on Elementary OS, you can search for feedback or issue, I believe, in the applications menu and open an issue there right from the operating system. It'll guide you to the right place on GitHub. Let's see. Selwyn Oren says, very interested in why the choice for Flatpak as opposed to other technologies like maybe AppImage.
Yeah, so it's funny. We actually looked into AppImage quite a long time ago when it was first coming out, and one of the major deficiencies of AppImage is that it doesn't really include any kind of package management and update flow. My camera just went to sleep. Am I back?
You're back.
All right. So that's kind of one of the major drawbacks there, but also, as we're trying to scale our application development, sandboxing is really important. And we're starting to see more and more on other popular platforms that when certain app developers have free reign on the system, that they always have users' best interests in mind, or that users don't always get to control their experience. So Flatpak kind of offers us like quite a lot of things in terms of application sandboxing, so that you can make sure that applications are privacy respecting and secure. It has a really great update system built in with things like Delta updates. So you're only downloading the difference between the version you have and the new version, which is really great for low bandwidth situations. And it also allows you to use platforms and runtimes so that you don't have to vendor in absolutely everything into each bundle. They can still share some platform dependencies, but if you do need to include additional dependencies, then that's something that you can do. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. Plus, Flatpak is built around kind of a decentralized system, which is similar to what we have with existing package management, where you can spin up your own repositories if you want. So if something ever happens and Elementary goes away, then someone could spin up a Flatpak repository. Or if you want to sideload Flatpaks from a different repository, like say FlatHub, you could totally do that. So we think that it's kind of a better technology that offers a lot more of the features we're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there's that blog post. I don't have the URL on hand, but on the blog.elementary.io, there's where we talk about the Flatpak decision. We talk about all those things there and go into a little more detail as well if you're interested in following up on that. All right, let's see. More questions from the chat. Where did we leave off here? Somebody asked what the Elementary OS origin story is. I don't think we have time to get into that right now. We've gotten into it on several podcasts and things in the past, though. There's a couple of questions about Handy specifically and how that interacts with GNOME, with libadwaita. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's kind of an ongoing conversation right now among a few different organizations about the future of GTK itself and some of these what we're calling HIG libraries like Granite and Handy and now libadwaita. And so we're kind of all getting together and thinking about how we want to build applications in the future and where these things lie. But for now, none of that changes in the Elementary Flatpak platform. And I think in the future that we'll probably still use components from things like libadwaita or libdazzle maybe. And it depends on what we can as a group decide that works better as something in GTK that we're all sharing, or what we're deciding that's more specific to each platform. So it's kind of an evolving story, but I think that it'll become better and better as we go.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and that's another awesome thing about open source is, we're in constant conversation with not only people developing on Elementary OS, but with GNOME, with people that are working on free desktop standards. So it's always an open conversation. Octavian Merla says, is it possible to develop Elementary OS applications on other distribution? I think they're saying to distribute Elementary OS applications on other distributions, like on Fedora with the Pantheon desktop group or an Ubuntu LTS with a PPA.
Yeah, so that's kind of one of the big things that we wanted to focus on with the AppCenter for Everyone campaign and moving to Flatpak is that when applications are published as Flatpak packages, you can install the AppCenter Flatpak remote on any Linux distribution and get those apps. So you don't need to use PPAs or Copper repositories or anything like that. You don't have to package apps in multiple formats. You can just distribute them as Flatpak once, and then anybody can install them.
Awesome. I think we're probably out of time for question and answer now, if I'm looking at my clock correctly.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you, everybody in the chat room, too, that's been sending those in. Keep those coming. We'll keep an eye on that. Now, up next is Akira, building a UX app from scratch.
Presented by Alessandro Castellani, an overview of the initial struggles and motivations behind the launching of Akira.
Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining this presentation about Akira, the Linux design tool. In this presentation, I'm gonna go through the major reasons or the most important reasons why I decided to start Akira, what problems I'm trying to solve with an application like Akira, how it compares to other applications, and then we're gonna do a little demo to show you the most important features and what we are looking for and all the future projects and expectations in terms of timeline or releases and all the good stuff. So let's get started. First of all, who the hell am I? That's a very good question if you have it. My name is Alessandro, I'm Italian, I love pizza and I hate soccer. That should tell you everything that you need to know about me, but in general, I've been a user interface and user experience designer for most of my life. I started when I was, I don't know, 17, 18, doing web design. At the time, it was called still webmaster, so I'm kind of old. I've also been a full stack developer for more than 10 years, going from front end to back end to DevOps to release engineering and all the other good stuff. So I have a pretty good understanding on the full stack in terms of web development. I'm currently the lead UX architect at Thunderbird. So if you don't like something about Thunderbird, it's mostly not my fault because I started recently, but we're trying to make it better. And I'm a free and open source software lover and user. That's very important to me, that I'm not just an advocate of FOSS application, but also I use it every day. I run Linux on my daily drive, I code on Linux, I design on Linux, and I just have Linux machines around as my primary computers. Little disclaimer for this presentation: all opinions are mine and are not meant to offend or criticize the work of anyone. Throughout this presentation, I'm gonna reference other open source applications that they do things in a certain way that I don't agree with. It's not to throw shade at them, it's not to offend whoever built this, it's just a technical analysis of what works and what doesn't. Just think of me as the guy that in a meeting usually asks always, all the time, is there a better way to do this? Because I'm the kind of guy trying to improve things the way we do it. What is Akira? What is it? So Akira can be summarized in a simple sentence, which is a 2D vector graphical application for user interface and user experience design. As usual, this sentence can say everything or says nothing at the same time, but throughout the years I've been trying to build Akira and trying to explain what Akira is. I found it easier to list what Akira is not. So Akira is not definitely a photo retouching or manipulation tool. It's not like Photoshop, it's not like GIMP. We don't have, and we're not planning to add any rasterizing photo manipulation options. It's not a digital painting tool, no brushes, no brush engines, no simulation of brush mixing colors, watercolors, oil painting, all that kind of stuff. No 3D graphics at all. is not a toolkit or code generator, and especially it doesn't aim to be a toolkit code generator. Probably in the future we're gonna have some export the SVG code or export some basic CSS if it makes sense, but by default it's just pure visual UI things, and especially it's not a print design. But also there's a maybe at the end, because maybe we're going to implement some support for CMYK, we're going to implement support for variable DPIs if you need to print, but is not in the current objective of the near future or the more impending release. Also, most importantly, Akira is not a replacement for the currently available applications out there. We're not trying to compete what currently is available in terms of open source applications. So we're not trying to compete with GIMP, Inkscape, Krita, Darktable, and all the other design applications or graphical applications that you see out there for Linux, open source application, or even closed source application for Linux. We are trying to create something new. We're trying to create something different, but most importantly, Akira aims to be the Linux alternative of Sketch, Figma, and Adobe XD. These three proprietary applications are the golden standard for user interface and user experience design in large-scale companies or in design firms, and those are professional applications. If you've never used any of these three applications, you're gonna have a hard time understanding what Akira aims to be. And it's not to criticize you, it's normal. If you're not in that environment, professional design for large-scale clients, you don't have the need of using these tools, because are very specific tools that completely change the experience and the workflow in which you design things, and they are considered, yes, the golden standard. Another very common question that I get asked all the time, but I asked myself at the beginning, is why a new app? Why we need to create another app? And this came from the questions also that, do you really need a new app to create something, to design something? And the answer is not really. I mean, yes, but also no, because in order to design something, you can absolutely achieve the same result with open source, free and open source software that you can with closed source applications or proprietary applications. And this is a very silly example that I put there, but just to give a very low level example of what I'm talking about, if you need to create a gray rectangle, the gray rectangle is going to pretty much look identical anywhere. It doesn't matter what applications you use. It doesn't matter if it's open source, a proprietary, closed source, in an Electron app or a native app. It doesn't matter. The result is always the same. But here we're not talking about designing a gray rectangle. We're not talking about doing a simple YouTube banner or a simple splash screen. We're talking about complex design work for clients with a specific workflow. So the problem here is that currently available open source applications are able to exactly create and produce the same result as closed source application, but the speed and efficiency in which you create those things with free and open source software, it's rather lacking behind what closed source application, professional grade applications offer. So what are these problems? Why applications like GIMP and Inkscape are lacking behind compared to professional applications? And there are like a million reasons, but I try to summarize the most glaring and the most important one that I've stumbled upon and I've struggled with throughout all my years of experience. So currently available Linux design applications are not a viable solution for a large collaborative professional environment. They're not widely adopted. And this is sort of a chicken and egg situation, because they're not widely adopted, so design studios don't use them. And because design studios don't use them, they're not widely adopted and they cannot get the market in order to be relevant. And this is more an issue of the design application itself is not challenging enough, is not feature complete enough, or not comparable enough to professional design tools. So they're not adopted and will never get adopted. And if you start doing professional design work on a large scale studio or for clients, 99.9% of the time you will find someone that uses Sketch or Figma or Adobe XD. That's it. They're not compatible with each other. This is also one of the huge problems. If you do a very complex design file in GIMP, good luck opening with Inkscape and vice versa. It doesn't exist an easy bridge between all these applications to open each other's files or even import some assets from those files, not even opening the entire file, just importing some assets. They're very disconnected between each other. The usability and user experience paradigms are extremely outdated on these applications. And a little example is that if we consider GIMP an alternative to Photoshop, that it's pretty similar to Photoshop and is trying to emulate Photoshop, and Inkscape as an alternative competitor to Illustrator, imagine that Adobe, the company that owns Photoshop and Illustrator, had to create a completely separated app called Adobe XD because Sketch and Figma were taking market share from them. They were just hammering down and grabbing all those designers from using Photoshop and Illustrator and transitioning to their apps because the user experience, the UX and the UI of those tools like Sketch and Figma are way superior when you need to do user interface design. And Adobe itself realizes that and said, okay, instead of updating Photoshop or updating Illustrator, we need to create a completely new app from scratch. That's why GIMP and Illustrator, they lag behind Sketch and Figma because are completely different interface and completely different workflow and user experience. But most importantly, they lack all the features that are now standard and expected. And there are a million different features, but the most glaring are reusable linked components. You can duplicate an item, like for example, you create a header, you duplicate it 20 times and as a component linked. And then if you change the parent color background, all the other linked components will get updated with the same color background. This is great for quick prototyping, quick visual prototyping, and also multiple design iterations. You're able to keep all your duplicated elements linked and you can go through multiple design iterations without doing manual update all the time. Built-in version control. A lot of these files, a lot of these tools, they have the ability to restore previously saved version of your design file, even if you close the application. Multiple artboards. Artboards have been around for almost 10 years now, and there's no trace of artboard support in GIMP and Illustrator, in GIMP and Inkscape or Krita. And artboards are vital for designers during multiple iterations problem, during client work that needs multiple versions of the same file. You don't want to handle 25 different files and then which one was the final one. You have everything in one file, separated by pages, separated by artboards, and can be organized properly, and many, many more. There are literally hundreds of features that are so vital and fundamental to today's standards in terms of workflow, in terms of being productive and being efficient, that are not available, and they're really hard to implement on currently available Linux design applications. Another question that I get asked a lot is that why you're not contributing to existing app. I tried. I originally attempted to fork Inkscape or even GIMP and slowly contribute upstream. But unfortunately, the source code was too complex and the application was, the current status of those applications are too disconnected from the primary goal that I'm trying to reach. So the major issues were a massive monolithic code base, which is not a bad thing per se, but that's one of the reasons why I put my fault in it, because I couldn't understand. It was too complicated to jump into an application that has been around for 20 years. Or even more, and understand the code and change the code and try to make sense of what I was reading. It was too complicated for me, so beyond my capabilities. all the things that I wanted to implement, the way that the new workflow, a new UI, a new objective needed to happen in this application was causing drastic code changes that will likely be rejected upstream. Same thing for the UI changes. I cannot literally, it's offensive towards the maintainers of Inkscape. I cannot jump in and say the user interface is completely wrong, let's change it entirely and let's redo it from scratch. It wouldn't be accepted at all. And also, as I said, the goals and new features of these type of application don't align at all with the current scope of these available Linux applications. So with that, I decided to create Akira, and I wanted to keep Akira simple, easy to compile, easy to build, and easy to read, especially. Few dependencies, very simple type of code, and thank God that Elementary stepped in and provided a very simple stack. So this is pretty standard things. We're using GTK, Vala, Elementary OS, the human interface guidelines with style sheet and icons, because they're more, especially at the time, they were the more comprehensive and complete HIG out there, and I didn't need to spend too much time on creating those from scratch. I was relying on professionals that were offering their toolkit in order to build something that it was humanly comprehensible and usable. And we're using Cairo as a graphics library via the GUCanvas API. We're probably getting rid of the GUCanvas API because they're a bit outdated, but Cairo is a pretty standard library that pretty much there are bindings for Cairo everywhere, and it's installed everywhere in every application, in every distribution ever. So it's pretty standard stuff. What are the key features that we want to implement in Akira? A million. And here I just a list of all the most important things. But in general, what I'm trying to do, I literally want to have everything that it's available in Sketch, Figma, and Adobe XD inside Akira. And that's the thing. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel. The wheel is already out there. It's pretty smooth and works pretty well. I just want to grab that wheel and bring it into Linux. It's demo time. So I talked a lot about all the cool things and how the usability and interface, it's so crazy and we can do better. Let me show you what I mean. Of course, the application is currently in alpha, so it might crash, and it's going to be very funny if it crashes. But nonetheless, I want to show you all the little nice little features that will improve your life by making you faster, more productive in reaching your goals. So first of all, the initial interface that you will see when you open Akira for the first time is like this. And this doesn't totally respect the human interface guidelines of Elementary OS, because we have the labels underneath the toolbar buttons. The toolbar will be populated with a lot of buttons. So it's gonna get pretty busy. And how many times you spent looking at the toolbar to the side of GIMP or Photoshop and waiting for a rollover and say, what is this? I don't know. I don't understand. What is this? Oh, this is a group or ungroup, or this is up or down. What does it do? Or union. Okay. No. Why? The first time that you step into an application that has a lot of icons, most of the times the iconography is not super clear. We're trying to fix that thanks also to Elementary, but there's no way that one icon will be universally understood by everyone. So there's an aid with the little text label underneath the button. Of course, after you get acquainted, you can change the interface, you can remove the label buttons. You can also convert and use symbolic icons if you don't want high colors icons that can distract you from your design. But in my opinion, this is very good and I like it. So let's say, for example, we create a rectangle. We have our little gray rectangle. First of all, the manipulation of this item. If I rotate this item and I shrink it from the size, of course, it respects the local coordinates of this item and it follows the local coordinates. If I deselect it and select it again, the rotation of the selection is remembered. It doesn't get reset to the regular bounding boxes, like for example it happens on Inkscape, and you can still resize it by its own local coordinates. Instead, on Inkscape it just reset it to the bounding box, and you end up having something like squishing it and skew it to the side. Is not very optimal, so we maintain this. Also, if you notice to the side, if you don't select anything, the panel is disabled. All the options are hidden, because that's something very important. The user interface should update to show the user what it can do at that time and what cannot do. So if you don't have anything selected and you're not interacting with anything, we don't need to show you that you can actually click on reorder up and down, or Boolean operations, or you can change the opacity, because you don't have anything selected. So if we if we select it again, now we have a bunch of options. For example, the border radius, we can control it and shrink it. We can change the color of the item. We can change the opacity. We can add a border. We can put like a green border, I don't know, 27 pixel. If I create an ellipse or a circle, you see we kind of have the same options here. The panel is enabled, the opacity we have the fields, but the border radius is nowhere to be found, because of course an ellipse or circle doesn't need to have the border radius option. So the UI is smart enough to understand that, okay, this component doesn't have the border radius attribute, the border radius component, don't show that panel, because that panel is just useless. Another thing that we focused a lot was the ability to quickly select your shape, the shape that you needed to select at that time. So for example, this is a pretty absurd example, but that might happen. You have something like this, right? You have hundreds of different shapes that are all squished together, and then you have an ellipse with the same exact color, and you put the ellipse on top. And now you need to select the ellipse. Good luck in trying to find it, what it is. But if you notice here, when you go and roll over on an item, to the side, to layers panel, we hover also the corresponding layer. And this option works also the other way. If you select or you go and roll over on an item on a layer, look what happens on the canvas. The layer matches, of course, the binded canvas item, and the item gets highlighted. So you need to select that circle, and you can drag it and put it out. It's pretty straightforward. You also have, as you notice, we have some smart snapping here that recognize all your sections. So if you have something like this situation, you want to central line it, it recognizes the most adjacent close by item and snap it to its edges. It recognizes also the center alignment, the left and right alignment, or complete like total center. Of course, you're in this situation, you're interacting with this, so we automatically kind of ignore that you don't want to interact with this mess of item, because it's not necessary, it's not useful right now. If you get closer, you can interact with them, of course, but the UI, as I said, it's trying to be smart and trying to help you with what you need. Another thing is here, for example, we have a bunch of colors. Here we also collect some global colors if you want. So I color these with green. Okay, let's say that you're doing some design and you have these green element, and then your boss comes in and says, I want these green element, and all the green elements I want to have a blue instead of a green. But you spend so much time in finding that perfect green color that you don't want to just simply override it, because maybe you override it, you save it, you close the file, and after 2 weeks your boss says, hey, instead of that blue that I told you, just go back to that green. But that green is lost unless you save an item with that green in your file just to remember what type of color. Here in Akira, we have the option to have multiple colors. So you can enable another color. For example, let's say wants this type of bluish color, and we want to enable another one. Let's put these like purple. So you can say, how does it look? Does it look better in purple, in blue, or in green? Let's do purple. Why don't we mix color? Okay, let's put blue and yellow, and then change the opacity of the yellow and see what type of color we comes out. Okay, so with this orangey and purple comes out pinkish color, salmon color, we got a salmon color, and these are two mixed together. So we have the ability to have multiple colors, like sort of an infinite stack of fields and borders in order to experiment and test all the options that we want without losing previous colors. These are going to be maintained. And if you don't need them, you can just hide them, but the item will remember that they're still there, but they're just hidden. So you can re-enable them. And if you don't really need them, you can just delete them and it's fine, and you keep what you need. But of course, we also keep global colors. We're going to have an option to have per document color, a sort of like local GPL library that says everything. Another important things in terms of the UI, for example, actually, let me launch another file so it's easier, another window. So for example, we have 3 items, 1, 2, and another rectangle like here, and let's put it at this green. So, and these items are one after another, right? The rectangle is the first one, ellipse at the center, and the last rectangle is the bottom. So if I select the last rectangle, you see here the move to top, bottom, the reordering of the Z index of these items changed dynamically. So you can put it up, you can move it to the top, but you cannot move it down or to the bottom because this item is already to the bottom. If I move it up and I put it all the way to the top, now it's at the top. So you can move it down or push it all the way to the bottom, but not to the top because it's already at the top. This is one very important thing in terms of the UI. The UI shows you what you can click and you cannot in order to avoid distractions. How many times in Inkscape you change the color in the color palette, then you realize you didn't select the actual item that you wanted to change the color, so you select that item and you lost the color that you just defined. This doesn't happen here because we know like you cannot interact with UI elements if you don't have anything selected. Another feature that we implemented is the artboards. Artboards are very important for quick prototyping. So on artboard, for example, if you have you can drag things inside, and the items that are inside are dynamically masked by the artboard. It's like a more smart group. You can move around and you can experiment with things. You can have multiple artboards. You can do a web design file or a website design with homepage, the about page, the contact page, the whatever, all the pages just separated into artboards one after another, and you can zoom in and zoom out and organize all the things that you want without needing to have multiple files or groups that they interfere with each other. If you want to see something slightly different, you can use artboards. Another thing that we have here is the export tool, exporting something very quickly and seeing what it's going to look like and how much it's going to weigh before exporting is very important. So if you export the current selection, we identify what you're selecting. So you don't need to create a slice, you don't need to resize your file, you just can select something and say export what I'm selecting. I don't need to create multiple variation of things. And here by default we are in this situation where we show the size of the final file, the exported, and we show also the file weight, but you have a little bit of control. You can define transparency if you want a transparent file, you can define type of options where to put it, but also you can resize it, so you can scale it twice. If you want for high DPI, you can simulate a high DPI by doubling up your export, or you can export it 4 times for like a 5K, 8K monitor. And we are gonna tell you how big is gonna be the actual dimension and the file weight, and you can increase the compression. And this is a preview. This is the actual export preview you're seeing here, so you can also check in real time the quality of what type of file you're exporting. Another thing, for example, if I save this file, we save files with the .akira extension. So test1.akira is going to be saved. If we open that file and if we check it in the documents, we have test1.akira. If I reveal the hidden files, you will see here we have a folder with ~lock, it's a hidden folder that has the same name of the file that you have open. In this folder, it's basically the Akira file is a zip file, a compressed file that handles everything and has built in a local GitHub repository that every time you save, it will create a separated commit with what you saved, because all your canvas with all your items is just a simple text JSON file with all the information, all the attributes. You have an artboard, you have the artboard 1, what type of components, you have the second artboard, you have the item, which is a rectangle with all the attributes and whatever. So it's just pure text that we can also compress these JSON files, and it's going to be super lightweight. And being just text saved, we're not handling complicated code or proprietary code. Is just plain open JSON with very simply readable attributes. We can save that as a commit inside your Akira zip file that you don't know it's a zip file, but it is a zip file. This will give you the flexibility to go back in time, scroll visually the different commit. In the commit history, we're going to save a screenshot of the current canvas whenever you save, so you have a visual representation of your commit at that point in time, and you can revert it back to what you need. There are a million different things, like you can, of course, resize from the center, you can resize locked, you can flip it, you can rotate it, you can control the opacity. We have other options here, import images. There are some very good options here to control the snapping of the canvas, the default type of shapes. If you want to create always a shape with a purple and a border of 6-7 pixels, this is the default. So it doesn't matter what you create, always will respect the default, and you can control that. So lots of options. This is just an alpha state, so a lot of things are missing, but we're working hard to deliver a first usable beta that it's going to be almost ready for production or partially ready for production. So yeah, this is very exciting. And to conclude, of course, if you're interested in the development of Akira, you can follow us on GitHub. We use GitHub for everything. We have the discussions to discuss new features. Even if you're not a developer, you can check and you can participate as a designer, because we use the discussions to visually prototype the features that we want to implement. If we want to change something, improve something, or you can follow us on social media. Of course, we are on Twitter, on Fostodon. And if you're so inclined, you can donate to the project via LiberaPay or Patreon. Yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you will follow and use Akira whenever it's going to be released. Thank you. Welcome.
All right. Now, joining us for a live Q&A is Alex and co-founder Cassidy. Gentlemen, that was a great talk, and I know we got some questions that came in. Thank you for being here.
Yeah,
Thanks for having me. Sorry.
Thanks for joining us, Alex. Yeah, we had some
much.
great questions from the chat, and also just had some questions when I was watching your talk that I had for you. Starting off, what about Elementary OS specifically made you choose it as the platform for Akira?
Yeah, I touched upon these reasons a little bit in the presentation, but overall, there are multiple reasons. The most glaring one are I have a web design and web development background, so I never did properly native applications, and I was looking at a stack that it was the most complete possible in order to start and be quicker, because I wanted to focus on the actual usability and on the actual implementation of the code. I didn't want to spend time I need to design icons, I need to design a proper UI that respects the operating system that I want to develop for. And Elementary OS provided the most easily comprehensible stack for me. Like, I literally learned how to start and building in a week with Vala and GTK and the Elementary OS human interface guideline. It was perfect.
Awesome. Yeah. And now with technologies like Flatpak, and especially with AppCenter for everyone, it's easier than ever to target Elementary OS, but distribute on other platforms as you see fit as well. So that's kind of exciting to see an awesome app like Akira there. Now, I know we were chatting a bit earlier about some upcoming fill features can you share just some of the more examples there, the layering, the different fills?
Oh yeah, that was one of the many features that I always loved about Sketch and Figma, the ability to add multiple fields or multiple color borders on the same shape and hide or remove which one I didn't want to use. In the future, we're gonna also add the ability to switch the type of field. So you will have a linear gradient or radial gradient or even an image. So you can literally have like a background color, like a flat color, and on top you can have a dark overlay gradient with a 50% opacity, and on top of that you can also have an image with a 20% opacity, so you can create some sort of like easily quick prototype, the usual like headers that you see in website with an image that has a little bit of opacity. You don't need to add an image and mask it to the shape that you want to mask it and then reduce the opacity. Everything is in the fields color panel of that same shape, so it's easily manageable.
Yeah, it seems like such a simple feature, but it makes it really powerful to prototype different things, and that's really cool.
It's not, unfortunately, it should be simple. It's not, because the SVG coding standards, they don't have like it doesn't have that type of standards accepted, so it needs to be something custom. And in the code, we are calculating all the mixing. We're mixing colors in order to just apply a simple color to the single shape. It's going to be interesting to see how we're going to manage it with images, but it's doable.
Yeah. So speaking of things that are nice and simple for users but complex to implement, Colin had a question. Are there any plans for adding online collaboration features to Akira?
Oof, 100% yes. How doable it is, we have no idea, but we will try to do it. It's very important to have at least like very basic collaboration in terms of multiple people connecting and leaving comments on the design that you're looking at. Not even interacting with the design, but just leaving comments or clicking on things and pointing on things. That's very important. So we're going to try to implement that in the future. 100%. That's something that we want to have.
Gotcha. Yeah. Another, I guess, feature request maybe here. Carlos asked, could Akira implement the Unsplash API in the future? It would be a great integrated image source.
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the many things that we want to implement. We are going to start implementing some external plugins. So we will have some bare bone code to show developers how to create plugins for Akira. And one of the two main plugins that we're planning to implement is the Unsplash API to add images super quickly to a shape or directly in the canvas. And also the Noun project is an icon website, icon pack, like just an icons gallery that has some great API. We're going to implement also that you can directly import SVG icons or load SVG icons from that library. So we're going to have those external APIs every time there's something open source and free and easy to use. We're going to integrate that to speed up development and design prototype inside Akira.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds really awesome. Having those things built into your tooling can make such a difference with saving time.
Yeah.
Sean Davis asks, how many people regularly contribute to Akira? Is it a one-person show or more?
It really depends. I would say it's a 2 to 3 person show sometimes. Most of the times it's just me. I'm the one that almost codes every day, but we have a couple of other people that are contributing right now, and it's very like seasonal. Sometimes we have a couple of contributors that are very involved every day, every week for like 2 months, and then they disappear because life happens. So it's hard to quantify, but yeah, it's an average of 2-3 people kind of always present. Yeah,
makes sense. Stanislaus says, will there be elementary UI assets in Akira?
Yes, absolutely. One of the many plugins that we wanted to develop is also UI toolkit import. And I'm not talking about the toolkit code, just the UI aspect. So we're going to allow users to literally drag and drop from a library of pre-built, I don't know, a buttons, a header bar, or a Granite window or a Granite dialog. You can drag it and you have the SVG built there as a composed shape or like a component that you can explode, and you have all the different elements inside. So yes, absolutely. And we're planning to do that also for the material theme or the KDE theme or other things. It's just, yeah, we want to implement that type of plugin so users can inject their own UI library, and users should be able to just drag and drop it inside the canvas.
Awesome. Yeah. Varun Singh asks, or says, it's too bright for me. Please tell me there's a dark mode.
Yes, there is. Go into the settings interface and check the checkbox toggle dark mode is there.
There you go. It's already done.
Yeah.
Somebody else, Gaver, says they just had an idea, a variable reference for colors of elements. So shapes refer to the color as a variable, and then when you change the variable, the referring shapes change. Is that something you've thought about or have plans for?
Yes, that's called the design system, is that when you define a color or even a style of a specific text, you assign that, you save that type of styling as a unique variable. Then if you update that variable, all the shapes and components and elements that you have in the canvas that use that variable are automatically updated. So yes, that's absolutely in the works and in the roadmap.
Micah Ilbury, hi Micah, by the way, great designer who has a talk coming up later, says, are there plans to add grids, guides, and rulers to make pixel perfect elements?
Yes, grids is already there. You can add a global grid to the canvas, but each artboard will allow to create columns grid. Like you can have a web layout type of columns, responsive columns. You can have rulers, all this. Pretty much all the usual things that design application has is going to happen in Akira, and it's going to be even better to use. We're going to try to make it easier and better, more scalable and more adaptable to the needs of the designers.
Awesome. Well, I see more questions coming in the chat than we have time to answer, unfortunately, today. But if you can stick around and answer them in the chat, otherwise,
sure, I'll try.
Can find another time to answer them. But thank you for joining us again, Alex, and thanks for your excellent talk.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you both. That was great. Now, coming up on the stream, we have Making an Accessible App.
Presented by Anna E. Cook. This session will talk about how accessibility creates amazing products, applications, and experiences, and introduce some best practices for accessibility in both design and code.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our chat about making apps accessible. I'm so grateful to be able to join you all for Elementary's EDW conference. But before we get started, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Anna. I use the pronouns she or they. I'm a senior accessibility designer at Northwestern Mutual, and I'm a master's student at the Atlas Institute of CU Boulder. In academia and industry alike, I've chosen to specialize in designing digital experiences that are as inclusive as possible, specializing in accessibility. In my free time, I'm an artist, gamer, and writer. I have two adorable cats named Felix and Onyx, shown here, a gray tabby and a black cat, black short hair. You may see one or both of those cats running around in my background today, but I will do my best to prevent that. Now, over the past 9 years of my career, learning about inclusive design has been fettered with blockers and educational gaps. So it's my ambition to help unblock designers, developers, and tech folks who want to build better, more inclusive experiences. Today, we're going to talk about what accessibility means for tech professionals, and a lot of this will include some of the basics. But we will talk about some of the essential considerations also for app development, particularly, as well as focusing on the operating system and things that go within that. Still, we'll focus on these essential elements because they tie directly in to our accessibility understanding, regardless of what platform we're designing and developing for. And And we'll talk about what that means and how that applies in this context as we go through. Okay, so every time I give one of these talks, I have to start it with why we should be talking about accessibility and why it matters. And a lot of us just haven't been taught about this and why this is so important. So I think it's one of the most essential parts of just starting one of these conversations, even if you're already aware as to why this matters and who we want to serve when we're doing this. This way, we're all on the same page as we go through the specific considerations. Accessibility advocacy is part of my job, along with making my designs and enabling others to make their designs more accessible. Even organizations like yours or ones that you're a part of currently, if they're bought in already, they still require a certain degree of understanding and advocacy no matter what. So having the skills to not only just know why this matters, but to be able to communicate why it matters with your teams is an essential skill of understanding how to make your work accessible. Knowing why it matters is the start for every conversation. Now, if we look at successful businesses like Apple, IBM, and Microsoft, we can see they all have years of ongoing dedication to accessibility. And that's no coincidence because a lot of them are succeeding and they're doing well. And any of us can talk about why we love elementary or our iOS or our PCs, but sometimes we can forget about the reasons we like them, and the reasons we like them being ease of use and accessibility. Some of these are things like iOS's Siri, for example, which was originally born out of accessibility considerations. Accessibility has been shown to help products and experiences create amazing products and experiences. Rather to say, they help us innovate past our bare minimum expectations. They help us go beyond what we expect to work and exceed far beyond where we've been before. And doing this means that our products can win against our competitors by capturing often overlooked markets and reducing our legal risk while we do so. But most importantly, doing accessibility and including it in our work means that we are improving the lives of disabled people. Now, for an example of how inclusive design innovates, I like to pull up one that's quite recent. We can look at Nike's Go Fly Ease sneakers, which are different than digital product design, but still include these principles and include them well. And it's a really good example of this. A few years ago, 16-year-old Matthew Walzer wrote a letter to Nike's design director asking for a shoe that he could put on independently with his cerebral palsy. Walzer wrote, "My dream is to go to the college of my choice without having to worry about someone coming to tie my shoes every day." Once Nike received this letter, they began developing a sneaker in partnership with Walzer and delivered their first release of that product a few months ago. These shoes have also become popular for people with a range of disabilities and needs because their design enables ease of use for all. And again, the same practice can be applied in digital products, applications, and operating systems. In most situations, there's no need to differentiate between usability and accessibility because their goals are actually quite complementary. Inclusive design is just better design, and accessibility is a form of inclusive design that focuses on disabled users. But another thing about designing with disabled people in mind is that 15 to 20% of people across the globe are disabled. Accessibility isn't a special need, it's just a need. It's not an edge case, it's core functionality. Every day, as tech professionals, we make choices that impacts people all over the world. We see the impacts of those choices in the software, websites, apps, operating systems, and all of the things that we're creating. But we can also see those systemic impacts of inaccessibility everywhere. And we are designers, developers, tech professionals because we want to make the world a better place. We want our work to have a positive impact. We want to make a difference in people's lives. We have disabled users now, and we're always going to have them as long as there are people. So by including accessibility into our process, we can meet our personal goals while also helping to expand the understanding of usability to broader and more marginalized audiences, which is really, really important. Accessible design is just also better for everyone because many of us are disabled or will become disabled in our lives. Accessibility isn't just for an ambiguous and unknown user. It's for our friends, our families, and ourselves. The persona spectrum shown here, sourced from Microsoft's Inclusive Design Toolkit, shows how accessibility can help people with permanent disabilities, such as blindness, temporary disabilities, such as cataracts, and even situational disabilities like distracted driving. The same logic can be applied to users who are using your applications, your systems, and your products. They can be experiencing a range of situations that affect how they interact with it at any given time. Not only this, but accessibility is a fundamental human right. People use our products to get healthcare, pay bills, get jobs, and yes, have fun. It's not a matter of accommodation when the designs we put out in the world might be the only way people have access. We create disability when we design without accessibility in mind. People feel that exclusion and they become disempowered. So our goal is to empower people, especially people who have been systemically marginalized. So these are some of the reasons for accessibility, but what does accessible design look like in practice? What does accessible development look like in practice? To make our work accessible, the first thing we need to understand is who we're considering when we create this. And the reason we talk about that is because people who are disabled are often using adaptive techniques and technology to interact with what we have created and put out there. So understanding how they're interacting and the ways that they're using this adaptive tech can help inform how we can better build out our products to serve and be there for them. The benefit of that, of course, is, as we discussed, the impact of accessibility is that it helps everybody and that it's good for our businesses. Now, the first group of people we'll focus on are people with vision disabilities. And when it comes to vision disabilities, keep in mind that people have a range of blindness and vision loss that doesn't just go from 0 to 100. That is to say, people can be using things like screen readers sometimes and not other times, or that they have color blindness, but it affects them in one part of the color or a few colors, but not others. This is essentially the way we want to think about disabilities in general. It's not on or off. People experience a range of needs and have a set of different circumstances that affect them uniquely. So when we think about vision loss, we think about people with blindness, degenerative vision loss, color blindness, and low vision. Now, for us, a big part of this is thinking about people who use screen reader technology. And I think one of the best ways for us to understand that is to actually experience a native screen reader user interacting, in this case, with a website, and seeing and hearing how that interaction occurs and the possible blockers that exist for them. So I'm going to go ahead and play a video for us for just a moment.
This is Mark Sutton from the University of California, San Francisco's IT Web Services Department. Here today with a brief tour of screen reading technology. I'm a blind person who has been using screen readers, braille writers, scanning equipment, other adaptive technologies since my childhood. What a screen reader does is, for example, I'm going to start to read this page.
Navigation item. Link, University of California, San Francisco. Link, about UCSF. Link, search UCSF.
And what I will now do is slow down the speech rate.
Rating percent. 75%, 70%, 65%, 60%, 55%, 50%, 45%, 40%. Link, UCSF Medical Center.
So as I was about to say, a screen reader converts what's on a computer screen into information that can be displayed through synthetic speech or braille output. And it does that by allowing you to use a computer instead of a mouse, a computer keyboard instead of a mouse. You can also use a braille display as an input device.
End of navigation.
And what it does is it cleverly determines what's on the screen and presents you that information in a way that would allow for efficient navigation of these pages. So for example, I could just keep reading.
Banner 3 items. Visited, link, image, home.
Line by line, and we could be here all day. Or I could jump to the first heading on the page.
Heading level 2, search for heading level 2. You are here. Heading level 1, make videos accessible.
So as I'm moving down through the page, I can look for the category that interests me. And I'm just using commands built into the screen reader. So that's all a pretty simple description of what a screen reader is all about. Now I'm going to go over and show a few examples.
Now, for our purposes, since we've got a little bit of time today, we won't watch the whole video. However, I highly encourage, and we'll make sure that you will have access to this presentation. I highly encourage watching the whole thing. It's super interesting to watch how folks are interacting with websites and with products using screen reader technology, and I enjoy it every time. Additionally, we want to be mindful of people who have limited vision. These are just a few examples of the ways that people might have limited vision and how that might limit them on a page that doesn't allow them to adjust according to their needs. For example, being able to zoom a screen up to 200% without loss of content or functionality. And then, of course, let's not forget folks who have color blindness. That makes up 4.5% of the population. There are 4 examples here shown where we have full color perception, red-green color blindness, blue-yellow color blindness, and then no color perception, which is rare. We want to be mindful that we're not just applying color as a way of conveying information to our users. That is to say, for example, maybe not using just a green dot to indicate a status, but also having text next to it that says what the status is. Online, green, offline, gray, things like that. A combination of elements to ensure that someone can understand what is being conveyed to them fully. Another key group of people to keep in mind are people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Again, deafness can have a range between partial deafness or complete deafness. Either way, remember, don't rely on audio to indicate the meaning of something in any context. Now, with our design and development of apps and products, this tends to not come up too much, but it can come up, particularly when you're focusing on a product that's video focused, say YouTube, for example. So be mindful of things like this when it comes to videos, podcasts, webinars, music, and more. Now, in this case, we're also going to talk about things like sign language and sign language interpretation. I'm going to show a quick video of a British Sign Language interpretation and captions so that you can see how videos can be made more accessible to people who are deaf and hard of hearing.
This is bad. Something's not right. This could be an emergency.
Stop panicking. Okay, it's probably nothing. We don't want to waste anybody's time.
Hang on. According to this forum, it could be indigestion. Or an exploding appendix.
Don't listen to this guy.
I really don't know what to do. Okay, go.
Just chill out, man.
When you're not sure what to do, go straight to NHS 111 online. And if needed, a healthcare professional will call you. Help us help you know what to do.
Again, that's an example of British Sign Language versus what we have in America, American Sign Language. There are facets of understanding and communication within accessibility, and that is super cool too, and I definitely recommend learning more. But again, captions are a great way to start making content like this more accessible to all of your users. In fact, many users who use captions aren't deaf or hard of hearing. Oops, there we go. There we go. We also need to be mindful of people with motor disabilities such as paralysis, muscular dystrophy, and joint conditions, and more. Now, you might be wondering, how does someone with a motor disability need to be served in a digital context? And there's a lot of answers to this question depending on the platform and the need, but in general, this comes down to keyboard accessibility or swipe accessibility and voice interfaces. Some with severe paralysis may put a stylus in their mouth and use that to navigate a keyboard and a touchscreen. So you'll also want to avoid requiring someone to perform an action in a specific way to do what they need to do. So for example, avoiding force swipe functionality on a touch interface, instead offering alternative means of access is going to be key. So another example, let's walk through how someone who has a form of paralysis, or rather uses a mouth stick to navigate, does that.
This is how I use my phone.
A woman in a power wheelchair uses a mouth stick to operate a smartphone that's sitting on the table.
Able Thrive. Hashtag this is how I.
That one's a little bit shorter, but you can kind of get the idea of how people interact with something like a phone very differently than you might expect. And so this is something that people are doing more commonly than you might think. So it's important to be mindful of that. Additionally, we want to be mindful of people with speaking disabilities. This includes things like muteness, stuttering, and a few other disabilities that affect speaking. In this case, a lot of our interactions focus on voice interfaces and ensuring that our voice detection tools can work with people who have speaking disabilities. Now, I'm going to talk about this one pretty briefly just because I think it's a super interesting subject, but definitely relates a lot to voice UI and a lot to conversational UI. And that could be a whole nother talk. So know to be mindful of this, and that, again, captions can be very helpful here. I'm going to skip through this video, but know it's made available to you. This is Google's Project Euphonia, which focuses on rendering speech to text with speaking disabilities. And then last, but certainly not least, keep in mind people with cognitive disabilities. People with cognitive disabilities tend to be the least understood in the context of product design and development. This includes people with autism, attention deficit, dyslexia, seizure disorders, and more. I know that there are a lot of things to keep in mind when it comes to serving people with cognitive disabilities. In this case, I generally mention that improved usability as a whole is super valuable. Often things that we call better UX directly correlate to improved accessibility for people with cognitive disabilities. Better copy, hierarchy, structure, consistency, all of these are going to play a big part in serving your users with cognitive disabilities. Now, last but not least, you might be thinking, wow, that's a lot of people that I need to think of, and how can I possibly design and develop with all of these needs in mind? Well, I've got good news for you. We have a lot of great accessibility standards that have been thoroughly vetted and continually developed to reference when working to meet accessibility standards. Many of these are interchangeable. Some of the things that you will do will serve different parts of populations. Again, like our captions serving our deaf and hard of hearing users, our users who have speaking disabilities. And by the way, those could also serve people with cognitive disabilities. So be mindful that it's not as bad as, it's not bad. There's plenty out there that can support you, and that there's plenty of opportunities to do well while meeting the group's needs of different groups all at once. And when it comes to following accessibility practices online, the best place to start is with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. WCAG is a set of specific standards designed to make the web more accessible to people with disabilities. This guide can evaluate, marketing websites, our favorite blogs, a web app, and really anything that can be accessed online. But what's really cool about this is that the Worldwide Web Consortium, try saying that 5 times fast, broke these guidelines and how they're applied into operating systems and applications themselves, and provided documentation into additional considerations. So long story short, you can use the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines in the context of designing apps, developing apps, whether they're web-based or specific to an operating system or based on the operating system itself. The practices and principles are generally the same, even if some of the implementation details are different. Now, WCAG or WCAG is broken into 4 guiding principles, stating that web content must be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, spelling the acronym POUR. Perceivable means removing any barriers to accessing our content by providing alternative methods of access. Operable means that our content, along with anything interactive on it, can be controlled through various tools like screen readers, for example. Understandable means to use language and functionality that's easy to comprehend and consistent. And lastly, robust means that our content should work well across different platforms. Now, you don't need to memorize these. More than anything, understand at a high level that these are the things to keep in mind, and that this applies to how WCAG is formatted. WCAG essentially has a set of guidelines that holds, all of those 4 principles. So every guideline included in WCAG fits into one of these 4 categories. Now, that's super important because you can kind of get the idea of what's being included in there and how it applies when you're thinking about it in that context. Now, additionally, every item in WCAG is going to have a rating system. Now, these 4 principles act as the categories that help hold all those specific guidelines, but the rating system helps us understand how essential it is for us to consider in our products. To help understand what the guidelines are, the most essential, to help us understand what these guidelines are, I've broken them out with a sort of basic understanding. Essentially, the A rating is the bare minimum, the AA rating is good, and the AAA rating is amazing. As a team, you generally want to pick what level you seek to meet, and then use that as a goal for how accessible your work should be. Now, for reference, most organizations choose AA as their bare minimum compliance level. And as a call out, there's no experience entirely AAA compliant in every page or category. Most experiences have a range of accessibility compliance levels, and different pieces factor into our design accessibility, such as what's on a page or what components being used. So be mindful that these are our goals. These are things we want to think about in terms of what do we want to meet, how do we want to meet it, and what do we strive for in the long run. They're not like a grade per se, but we do want to try to seek to meet at least bare minimum, and that is at least A levels. Now, to provide some context, I've broken out compliance levels using color contrast on a button as an example. We have 4 different buttons in different shades of gray on a light background and then on a dark background. The ratings on these show if the contrast is high enough to be legible. As you can see, or rather not see, the first button on the left does not meet acceptance levels on a dark background. But that same button has a AAA rating on a light background, and we can see similar instances depending on how color is applied. WCAG color contrast compliance indicated in guidelines 1.4.3 and 1.4.6 only have AA, and AAA levels. Now, ideally, we would want to meet AAA, sure, but AA works just as well, as shown here. We can also increase our compliance level by increasing our font size or our font weight. That is to say, making it bold versus regular size weight. So how we apply WCAG and what the guidelines that we are considering are really depends on our goals, our teams, and the ways that we're building things themselves. But it's really important to be mindful of that, as something like a button, when used everywhere, can change how an entire experience is being interpreted and interacted with. If you have a single button that doesn't meet color contrast compliance and it's being used across your application, then you end up with the possibility that users are struggling to interact with a button across the application. And it's kind of the same way as design itself when you think about it. You want to make sure the core elements and the components themselves that you're using when designing and developing an app or an experience are as accessible as possible. And that empowers your team to be more likely to scale up, to be more accessible as you scale up. It's not always going to be like this. There's always going to be times where the component itself needs to be considered a little bit further when it comes to the implementation details. But when you're starting with an accessible system to start with, then you end up with the ability to be more likely to support this. And that's why I usually recommend starting accessibility in design systems. As you're digging into your accessible design practice, I've put together some resources and tools to help you get started. Now, WCAG's Quick Reference Guide is a fantastic resource, but I've also included the A11Y Project Checker if you prefer. Now, the A11Y project as a whole is also a great resource. I recommend these resources to those who are not as familiar with WCAG and accessibility practices as a whole, and who want sort of a checklist to get started as a way to kind of validate if they're passing or doing something or need to be thinking about something as they're going through their work. Keep in mind that not everything's going to need to be checked against everything. That is to say, you don't need to be necessarily thinking about caption accessibility in the context of creating a button. So know that while these lists can feel a little intimidating at first, when you're using them on specific pages in specific contexts, they tend not to be as intimidating as you might think. Additionally, I've also included some specific documentation that talks about accessibility for non-web technology, that is to say, operating systems, APIs, ICT products, again, non-web products that focus on how to meet accessibility standards and how WCAG applies in those specific contexts. Again, you're going to want to use those principles as a whole. And the great news is that we live in a time where a lot of those principles are finally being conglomerated into WCAG. But you can use these additional 3 guides shown here as a way to kind of establish a little bit further, go farther than what's being indicated, and have more specific guidelines, because there are going to be things that do differ, especially when it comes to things like how it's being developed and the implementation details around that. Keep in mind that we're all going to be learning and growing. The biggest thing I want to emphasize, and I know there's so much to take away from these conversations, is that you don't have to be perfect. I know our time's brief, and I know if this is something new to you that you might feel a little overwhelmed, but all I have to say is that everything you do, every effort you make to be more accessible makes an impact. Every time you dig into an accessibility question or a thought, you're empowering yourself to learn more. And when you're discussing that with your team, you're empowering them to do the same. Every time we have conversations about this and facilitate those conversations, that helps everybody grow and all of our products thrive and succeed when it comes to inclusivity. Those conversations can make us less afraid and push for accessibility in a way that doesn't make people or each other feel defensive. And that's really important for the work we're doing. You don't have to be an accessibility expert to advocate for accessibility. So know that you don't have to be perfect, and know that there are many ways to be an advocate. With that, I want to thank you, especially thank everyone at Elementary and EDW for coming and inviting me to this talk, or to give this talk, I should say, and for taking the time to learn more about this at any level, because it's so important.
That was great. And now, for a live Q&A, Dan and Anna are joining us. And I loved that talk. Anna, thank you so much for being here today. Take it away.
Hey, Anna, thank you so much for that talk. That was so good. We got so many great questions in chat, actually, and it's cool because a couple people are talking about this idea that they don't really consider themselves disabled, but they really benefit from accessibility features. Can you talk a little bit about your perspective on that?
Yeah, well, a lot of us, especially in the accessibility community, talk about how accessible features tend to be better for all users. And I remember reading even quite recently that 80% of people using things like captions aren't deaf or hard of hearing. So things like, things that we may not consider as minimum viable product are actually tend to be things that people find beneficial overall. And so they call it the corner cut effect, where in the example of the corner cut effect, you talk about a sidewalk that has the cut so that people in wheelchairs can get up and down the sidewalk with ease. Well, this also benefits people who have strollers, people on bicycles, people who have canes, people who, like me, are uncoordinated in general. So there's a lot of like great things that come with accessible design.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so one of the questions I'd like to ask you here is, what are some of the most common issues or accessibility traps that you've noticed in your day-to-day usage of some apps and platforms?
It's a great question. I think the most common traps I see are not really thinking only visually and not programmatically. So where you tend to see some of the biggest gaps for users is how you're, let's say, applying a heading to some of your content and having it only visually structured instead of thinking about it in terms of what's being represented in your code. And so, I think that comes up a lot for things like, even just adding alt text or making sure your structure is consistent, or making sure that that everything's kind of semantically tied to your design, which is why, accessibility is a designer's job too.
Yeah. Ando says that he notices that there's a lot of emphasis now finally being put on accessibility in tech, but he's wondering what role does inclusivity have in accessibility?
I mean, it's a very important question because in tech, we tend to think about, even when we're getting people to start thinking about accessibility, we aren't connecting the dots with inclusivity and accessibility as a whole. And while accessibility is important, it's a part of inclusivity, not the whole. So, I think a big part of this is remembering that a lot of accessible design also benefits users who have low bandwidth. It also benefits users who, generally speaking, have been marginalized in other ways. Now, that being said, there are also additional considerations that we need to be mindful of when it comes to making sure our users who are Black, Indigenous, people of color are being served and seen and represented, and that our LGBTQIA folks are being represented, and everyone has a place. They feel welcome and included, and it's super important. And it's not emphasized enough in tech yet. It's happening, but it's not being talked about enough. So it's a great question, and what I will say is the answer is not easy.
Yeah, I love that, and you're right that we are starting to make a little bit more inroads into talking about accessibility, but we need to really platform people that are working on inclusivity as a whole. We have another question from chat here. What do you think about AI assistants like Siri or Cortana and their role in accessibility, and if we should be investing in that kind of thing in the Linux desktop space?
Honestly, I think tools like Siri came out of accessible design, and disabled users use that functionality all of the time. And so in terms of investing in that, I think voice interfaces are already becoming huge as we're speaking right now. And so, if I could say, like, broadly speaking, investing in it is going to be important, but it's also important for your marginalized, your disabled users. And so if you have the capacity to consider voice UI and those interactions, I would absolutely advocate for it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's something that I know that I use all the time on my phone is the voice assistant. And it's really helpful when you just don't have a free hand as well, or when you're multitasking or, working with someone else or driving and just maybe, experiencing temporary disability too, right? Like pains. Can you talk a little bit about maybe temporary disability in that context?
Yeah, this is such a great point. If you haven't seen, you've seen it, but if other folks haven't had a chance to look at it, Microsoft has an inclusive design toolkit, and it is super helpful. But it also talks about how disability is not necessarily permanent. That is to say, some of us are disabled momentarily or temporarily or situationally. And so, for example, I could have a broken arm and that would limit my ability to interact with certain things. Or, a bright light could be shining on my phone screen and it would make it hard for me to read the text that's on that screen. So, it's a great question. The reality is that people who aren't medically disabled can still become socially or, interactively disabled because of that lack of consideration.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I got one more question from chat before we have to let you go. Someone wants to know about video game accessibility, especially with regard to 3D video games. Do you have any experience with that?
I mean, what I can say is that I'm just so thrilled with what's happening in the video game community right now. And they've shown us that games like, The Last of Us, Miles Morales, Spider-Man story, they have shown us that accessibility can start being integrated today. We don't have to wait for some unknowable legal thing or somebody's permission. That's starting to make accessible work now makes better work. And gosh, I am just with the last year we've all had, video game accessibility was it was already important, but it's so close to my heart because it kept me together this past year. So my experience is there's a lot happening, and please be paying attention if you like video games.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you hang around in chat to answer a couple more questions. And I'm really grateful that we had the opportunity to platform some accessibility talks here.
Thank you.
Anna and Dan, thank you very much. I completely agree with the chat room. Makes me think about this in a whole new way. Now, up next is improving app development in Vala.
Presented by Princeton Ferro, this talk is a look behind the scenes into the ongoing work improving the Vala developer experience.
My name is Princeton Ferro, and I'm one of the developers of the Vala language server, and I'm a contributor to the Vala project. And this is my talk on how to improve app development in Vala. So I'm going to talk about the language server I've been working on. Then I'm going to sort of talk about more general topics about how to improve Vala as an ecosystem. So when we think about Vala, when we think about any language as an ecosystem, language has tools. And when we start off without any tools for a language, or with very few tools for a language, one of the first big steps we can take to improving the developer experience is to have a language server. And language servers are very important because they allow developers to look at how their code is changing in real time and to analyze it in real time. And doing this allows you to iterate much faster than you normally would. And when you iterate faster, you develop higher quality apps. So before we had a language server, you had a variety of choices, and none of these was very good. The problem with them is that their functionality was not consistent, and they depended heavily on the capabilities of the editor. And so if you wanted Vala to be supported in one of your editors, you had to write a plugin for it. And this meant that there had to be a lot of duplication of effort to get Vala supports in the editor. So along came this thing called the language server protocol, which basically allows you to write one language server for n editors. The protocol allows an editor to say what features it supports and a language server to say what features it supports. It's very modular. So an editor does not have to support everything in order to work with a language server and vice versa. So when we look at the architecture of the language server, the Vala language server, there's basically a number of components. We have a documentation engine, we have a protocol layer, we have the project manager, which I'll talk a bit more about, and then we have various language providers, which are for the various things you want in a language server, like code completion, outlining, signature help, symbol search, refactoring operations, and so on. And then all of this stuff is built on top of the Vala compiler. So initially we had some problems with the compiler itself. One of the big problems affecting usability was memory leaks. So the compiler was not designed to be a part of a long-running process like a language server. And so there were a lot of memory leaks, and we plugged a lot of them. I think we plugged all of them basically. And by doing that, we reduced memory consumption of the language server from a few gigabytes to a few hundred megabytes on average, most projects. Also, the compiler would just totally stop if it encountered syntax errors, and it didn't proceed to semantic analysis. And so that meant that, as you're typing something, you want to have the compiler continue to analyze the symbols in your document so that you can get completions, even if you're typing something that is not semantically valid. So we had to address that with a series of patches to the compiler, to the parser more specifically. So the next challenge is we want user interaction to be fast. So when you're typing, we want you type something like a dot, we want you to get completion instantly. And there's two things that we do here. Because code context updates, recompilations are happening on the main thread, we have a possibility of, we have the problem of main thread blocking all interaction while you're compiling. So we want to make sure that we're delaying the context updates as much as possible until after the user is done typing, rather than trying to do it in every single key press. And then also we have this parser we wrote on top of it, on top of the existing parser, which runs from your cursor backwards to the end of the expression. And it's lightning fast, and because it doesn't have to obviously parse the entire document or to parse the entire project. And so using that allows you to get very fast completion for 90% of the cases where you're writing some sort of simple expression that can be parsed very easily. Now we also want to think about project management. Now, some language servers don't do a lot of project management, and they leave it to the editor to do the project management. Then the editor is supposed to send information about the project to the language server, and the language server is supposed to be agnostic about what the project is. And the problem with this approach is that you have to implement project management in the editor. So that means that if you wanted to have, if you wanted to support Vala in this case, you'd have to implement project management, like for the Meson build system, in every editor you want. And so you run into that similar problem with having to do things across n editors. So instead, what we do is we take the idea, we take the idea that the server should implement as much about the build system as possible. And in Vala, we have very good integration with Meson. And we can do this because Meson has a very friendly introspection API. Vala is a first-class citizen in Meson, and also most Vala projects use Meson anyway. So we're covering a lot of ground just by supporting Meson. I looked at auto tools, and I don't think it's worth supporting because it's not used by many projects now, and it's also too complex. It doesn't have an introspection API. CMake is a possibility. There's a few notable large projects that use CMake, but Vala is not a first-class citizen in CMake, and they get Vala support by having these macros that they bundle with their project, with their build system. And the problem with those macros is that they don't produce introspection data that allows us to look at the compiler arguments for the project, for example. So if we wanted to fix that, we would have to first write the CMake set of CMake macros, and then send pull requests to the existing projects that use CMake and Vala, and get them to use it, and then we could think about CMake support. But so there's some ideas and discussion about it, but I don't think it's worth thinking about right now too much. Then we have more basic things. Navigation, obviously, you can search references, you can search for all symbols in your document, you can go to implementation, go to hidden methods, that sort of thing. And we have so far very basic code refactoring capabilities. You can just rename a symbol and it works, but that's what you have so far. When it comes to documentation, the way how that works is, well, most libraries, most glib-based libraries are installed with a large file called the GObject introspection file, and it's used by GObject introspection to create bindings for other languages. But a lot of times these files contain, it's like a big API file and this is a description of the API, and it contains a lot of times the code comments and documentation for it, which is usually written in the GTK doc format, which is what's used for, like if you ever use diff help and you look at the docs there, it's the same thing. So we just parse that, and that's how we show you documentation. The docs are usually written for the C version of the language, of the API. So an additional step, it would look very weird to you to have to look at the C API and sort of translate that mentally in your mind. So we just do something extra where we sort of convert all of that stuff to what it would look like in Vala. And so this gives you documentation. It looks more like Vala documentation, even though it's generated from C documentation. So you think about what what editors you can do this in today, as opposed to like a while ago. We actually have a lot of editor support now, and some of this comes from plugins and some of this comes from built-in support on the side of the editor. So with Visual Studio Code, we have a Vala plugin you maintain. It's very good. You should use that. GNOME Builder, we also have a plugin bundled with VLS. So if you install VLS, you get GNOME Builder support. Vim, if you you can set up Vala support like this. You install Conquer of Completion. You add this snippet to your config, and you're good to go. You can also, NeoVim has another plugin called LSP config, where the developers of that have implemented Vala support. So if you install that, there's no config, you just get it. Kate's recent merge requests added support for Vala language server, so that's built in now. Emacs, you can just install LSP mode, and that plugin also has built-in Vala support. Sublime Text, you can install these in two packages and add this to your config, and you're good to go. So it's very easy to start using Vala in all sorts of editors compared to the way things were a while ago. So what are my future plans for Vala language server? Well, there's a lot of future plans we could have because there's a lot to do. One of the things I want to tackle is responsiveness. If you try using VLS with very large projects like Geary, for example, which is like 30,000 lines, I think, you run into problems that, like, it's slow, right? And there's two ways we can think about solving this. One of them is it's slow because, like I said earlier, we're doing compilation on the main thread because the compiler library was it's not designed to do multi-threaded compilation. So we're blocking all of the requests to the language server while we're compiling your project. So there's two ways to address this. One is to say, threaded compilation. We're going to have a separate worker thread, and we're going to create a new code context and just do compilation there. Once we're done, we switch it with the old one and we destroy the old one. The problem with that is that it requires you to duplicate memory a lot. And so that can, when you have like 100 megabytes for your project, that's okay. But if you look at a project like Geary or even the Vala compiler itself, that's the code context for that is like a gigabyte. So duplicating that is not ideal in memory. So the other thing we can do is, well, we can observe that, when you update a file, you're not really changing much of the whole project. In fact, you're changing a very small part of it. So there's a lot of code nodes that would be the exact same once you're finished recompiling. So implementing incremental recompilation is an approach, and I'm leaning towards that. There's of course problems where, like, okay, let's say you're refactoring a symbol that's used everywhere, then you can't get around that. So you're going to have to recompile everything. So it's going to be slow in that case. But I think that's going to be more of the exception than the rule. Obviously, code refactoring, it's very basic. Like I said, we just have renaming support. So there's other things that I have on my radar. A lot of these things are very common in editors like VS Code and IntelliJ IDEA. So organizing imports, inlining, changing the signature of a method, deleting method, stuff like that. Completion is a very case-by-case thing. So there's just a whole bunch of cases that I'm not going to go into. There's a link below with a milestone for a lot of the different cases. In general, we want code suggestions to be context sensitive, meaning that we don't just want to show you all of the symbols you can see, that the compiler can see, but rather we want to show you symbols that are only relevant for what you're trying to do. So for example, if you're creating an object, like you're doing new something, right? We want to show you namespaces that contain types, and these types are types that have constructors, or they're types that you can instantiate, or otherwise something that can be used in that expression, right? We don't just want to show you like constants, for example. That doesn't make sense. And working with that configuration means we want to just do the right thing without having to have preferences or anything like that. So here's an example of that. So for example, we want to have smart method completion, right? So most projects have a coding style that looks like the first thing, right? But there's a few projects that have a coding style that looks like this thing, the second thing. For example, Geary has that. So rather than having like a configuration option that says, complete a method with 1 space or 0 spaces before the arguments list, we want to, linters are already capable of just looking at the whole style of the code and figuring stuff out. So we want to basically run a style analyzer and then just know how to do the right thing without any config. Complete it the way your coding style would, the way that agrees with your coding style. Also, we want like global completion. So that means like you're trying to complete a symbol. It's not, you haven't imported namespace though, so it should just be able to import the namespace for you. That's not really too complicated. So now I'm going to talk more about like how to improve Vala in general as an ecosystem. So when we look at the ecosystem like a year and a half ago, you didn't really have much, I think, without trying to say too much. I think that the addition of this language server has improved things, but I think there's still a lot of room for improvement in the infrastructure. And so, so let's think about some things we can improve. So one thing is, tooling, more types of tools I'm going to talk about. And then there's also like how we can improve the website, documentation, and then community spaces. So one really useful tool that other languages have is a static analyzer. And what a static analyzer does is it performs very deep analysis on your code. And it tends to show you things that a compiler would not normally show you. So it tends to show you things like, null pointer access or use after free, or something like that, right? And it shows you something that it thinks might happen, but it cannot necessarily prove will happen. And that's okay, because even if it shows you some false positives, it's still sort of hinting you as to areas in your code where there's behavior that might potentially lead to something wrong. And one thing that Vala would benefit from with static analysis is reference cycle detection. That's something I think that can be a pitfall for a lot of Vala developers, having leaks in their programs. So for example, static analysis could look at this example of a recursive data structure, a list, and in this add method here, we have a assignment to prev, and also an assignment to next for the current object. So this current object creates a strong reference to the next object, and the next object creates a strong back reference to the current object. A static analyzer could look at that, and it knows that since list is a recursive data type, we're creating a cycle here, and it can just say, you have to change one of these fields to weak reference. Another thing that can trip people up, in fact, it tripped me up, is that closures can take strong references to the objects that they were created in. So in this example, this class here will never be garbage collected because the closure for the tree set grabs a strong reference. And so a static analyzer could very easily tell you that this is something that you have to fix. And this would be the fix. For example, you have a method that returns a new closure with a weak reference to the object. We also want to think about how we can do linting and formatting better. So linters, as opposed to formatters, generally they're more involved. They suggest fixes to code structure and semantics, and they're there to sort of catch unintended behavior, not so much style, right? Not just style. So like formatters are just basically code prettifiers. They tell you about style, but linters tell you about actual behavior. And so Vala has this nice tool called Vala lint. It's very nice, but it's mostly just a code prettifier. So it's like Rust format, for example. But we also, I think, should have something like Clippy, which is the linter for Rust. So here's an example of how Clippy works. We have this Rust code here, and we're comparing two floating point values for equality, which is a problem. So we run Clippy on this, and first it tells us the error, then it gives us a suggestion for an alternative, and it says, oh, we have to subtract the two things, get the absolute value, compare it to the error margin. Then it says, oh, you can use these constants for the error margin, and then it says, if you still want more information, you can go to this link. So something like that would be very useful for Vala developers. Templates. So templates are very important. They allow developers to just get straight from nothing to writing code, skip past all the writing of build scripts and configuration, stuff like that. And in C#, there's an official tool called .NET New. And so you say .NET New, name of my project. Let's say you want to create a console application or a server application. You say console or a new server, whatever, and it just sets up the project for you. So and these templates come from the community as well, and other languages have similar tools like this. So I think Vala should have something like this, and along these lines, I introduced Baldo with this idea, and so far we just have three templates, but I actually got one pull request yesterday for a new template, and I think this would be good if it took off. And if anyone has ideas for templates, they should submit a pull request. I think it would be very good if people were to send in their ideas for more templates. Then also, I think we should think about dependency management. So if we look at how other languages manage dependencies, like we look at Rust, JavaScript, Go, C#. With that, you have dependencies that are per project, and they're either linked in statically to your app, or they're bundled in. And with Vala, you don't have that. With Vala, the dependencies are system-wide. You can't, they're dynamically linked in. You can't say, I want to have this version of this dependency, and it can be something different from another dependency that, from what another project uses on the same system. So I don't have any sort of proposals too much about this. You could, Meson, for example, has the wrap system, which allows you to sort of specify a link to a repository to compile for a dependency. But that's kind of a bit clunky. I think something we could have a tool that's sort of like has this sort of baked in, that's kind of language that sort of works with the language more. So, but I'm just throwing this out here as an idea. Like, I don't have a proposal for it. So something to think about. The website, you look at the Vala website, it's not very friendly to newcomers. It has a lot of, a lot of text, not anything that quickly gets you to examples or tutorials. You have to scroll all the way bottom. It doesn't really advertise the language very well, in my opinion. There's work on a new website at a new domain. It's very preliminary, but we want to sort of redesign things so it's more streamlined, and we want to have like a learning page and something that can be very attractive to newcomers with no experience to the language. I think we should also think about documentation as well. Voldoc is very, very good, but it's also mostly just an API browser with code snippets. There are many existing tutorials out there, and some of them are pretty good. And I think if we're rethinking documentation a bit, we could think about how to centralize these things, sort of like how on other projects, like for example, Rust has like a central area where you can say, I want to read a tutorial about how to use the language, I want to read about best practices, or I want to read about the API, right? Like having all that in one location is, or even like a playground as well as like a fourth option. Like having all that in one location is very, like in a learning center is very helpful for developers. Lastly, the community, having better community spaces. So there's IRC, that's very good. There's also the elementary Slack. Recently, a Discord was created. It's just another thing that, some people like to use Discord as opposed to other spaces. So just creating more spaces that people are interested in using is a good thing, I think, for developers. And it's become quite popular. We have close to 100 users now. I encourage more people to join. Also, a Twitter account was created to promote the language. You should consider following it, perhaps. So yeah, that's pretty much my talk. Thanks for listening. If you want to, I'm Prince781 on IRC and on most other spaces. You can contact me for more information. Yeah, and thanks for listening to my talk.
And now, up next is a live Q&A with Princeton and Elementary co-founder Cassidy Blady. Sorry, Cass. Yeah, try. Go ahead, guys. You're up.
Hi. Thanks so much for your talk, Princeton. Just a few questions here from the chat. And a reminder to everybody watching, if you have any more questions about improving app development in Vala, please drop them in the chat now so we can see them. So one question I had is, I know a lot, and a couple of people mentioned it in the chat, Vala developers have been looking forward to language server integration in elementary code, our code editor in elementary OS, for some time. And as far as you know, what are the next steps that could lead to that becoming a reality?
Yeah, so most importantly, code needs to have an implementation of the language server protocol, which it does not have right now. And so that requires writing a backend for the language server protocol. And then also on top of that, the visual changes, there are some visual changes that are needed to accommodate features like showing call hierarchy or showing completion for method calls and so on. So basically, those two things are quite needed.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I know there's been some progress there on elementary code. For those interested, following along at home, you can check out github.com/elementary/code and check out the issues and pull requests there for the progress. Carlos mentioned for them, autocomplete is one of the most helpful features in a programming language tool. Is there a plan for an IntelliJ IDEA plugin?
So IntelliJ actually has language server protocol support, but I think I don't think it's built in. There's a popular plugin for it though, and I actually was able to get Vala language server working in it. However, there also has to be a plugin made for syntax highlighting and also for supporting some of the commands that the server supports. So that's what is remaining. Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always interesting seeing all the different code editors people love to use on elementary OS to write Vala apps. There's a whole bunch of them out there.
Yeah.
Brian asked, is there a Mason LSP server?
So to the best of my knowledge, there isn't one, but that's actually a very good idea. And I thought about even writing one myself, but maybe I'll do that when I'm not working on these things right now.
Yeah, there's always so much to do. Varun Singh mentioned that as a newcomer, they were a little intimidated by how to get started. If they would love to learn Vala, where would you suggest they start?
So Alessandro has a good tutorial set. He was the one who just did a talk about Akira. That's a good place to start. I also think that hanging out around some of the community spaces like IRC and Discord, you can ask questions and learn a lot, as well as there's also a subreddit, Vala subreddit, to ask for help. And there's also some code examples on some of the links that I posted in my last slide, or second to last slide, had some good code examples, I think. So there's a lot of resources.
Yeah, and I mean, especially if you're looking at developing on elementary OS.
As well as elementary.
Developer.elementary.io is we have our getting started guide linked from there. As somebody who in the past had never written a line of Vala, that was instrumental in getting me able to write and distribute apps on elementary OS. So I highly recommend that as well. And just the fact that there's so many Vala apps, there's hundreds and hundreds of Vala apps open source out there. That can be another way to get involved, is just take a look at an app that's written in Vala that you're interested in and see how things are built under the hood. Maybe try your hand at contributing to an existing app. It's a little less intimidating than writing a whole app from scratch sometimes.
Yeah.
Let's see. Checking for any more questions. It looks like that may be it for now. Thank you again so much for your great talk, and thanks for joining us here at EDW.
Sure.
That wraps up our talks for day one of EDW. Thanks again for everybody joining us.
Thank you, guys. That was fantastic. Dan, Cass, we're going to do it again tomorrow.
That's right.
And thank you.